her energy. Every time I'm around her, she just lights up a room. Let's make some noise, show your appreciation for Miss Wanda Allen.
First off, I want to thank Truth and Comedy for welcoming me back again to tell my story. I got a lot of rapport the first time that I told it last year. The response was just really overwhelming. So I'm really excited about being here again. I was 38 at the time when this all began. I was working for a moving company by day, and I was going to school to be a medical assistant at night. I met this guy at an automobile repair shop, and his name was Yori, and we went out on a date. We'd go out bowling, we'd go and shoot pool, we'd go to the movies, you know, the normal stuff. And after a few months, Yori moved in with me, but Yori was a drug dealer. Now, the place I was living was on in North Dallas. It was on Fair Oaks and Park Lane. And if you know anything about Dallas during the late 90s, that area rolled. It was one of the hottest blocks in the city. But if you're a drug dealer, the number one rule was supposed to be that you don't sell drugs where you lay your head at. And so I had this nosy neighbor, and her name was Michelle. Michelle was one of those people that could tell you everything that was going on the block. In fact, she knew more about what was going on in your house than you did. And on this particular day, I had come home from work, just got out of class, and I was tired. I pull up in the parking lot, and who do I see? Michelle. She's standing out there waiting for me. So I'm rolling my eyes, I'm gathering my stuff, I'm getting out of the car, and here she comes. Oh, Chocolate, you ain't gonna believe this. Girl, look, Jory just had your apartment just on blaze today. Girl, he was serving the crackheads out your front door. The police was out there. Oh, Chocolate, it was terrible. Girl, what you gonna do? So by this time, I'm mad. I'm walking toward my apartment, and I'm just living. And, you know, me and Jory, we never really fought. You know, we would have arguments and stuff. And if I wanted him out of my apartment, I would just call my homeboy Black. And I'd tell him, come get this boy out of my apartment. Well, Black would show up. He'd have Henry J. and Luke with him. And he'd look at Yori and he'd say, man, Chocolate wants you out of her apartment. So Yori would look at me and he'd look at them and he'd get his shit and he'd leave. So, like I say, I'm living. I'm going into the apartment as soon as I walk through the door. He's like, hey, babe. I'm like, hey, babe, shit. What the hell have you been doing in here all day? So I start going off on him about everything that Michelle had just told me. So the next thing I know, a push goes to a shove, and then we're on the floor, and we're tussling. And he had me pinned down at one point where I couldn't really, you know, move. And so to get him up off of me, I headbutted him as hard as I could. And he bit me. The next thing I know, blood is just gushing out of my face, and my face just feels like it's on fire. And he jumps up and he starts screaming, look what you made me do, look what you made me do. So I'm stumbling to my feet and I'm like, get out, get out. And he's like, no, I need to, you know, stay here with you. And I'm like, no, get out. I need to go to the hospital. I need to call an ambulance. I need to call the police. And he's like, but you ain't got to tell them that I did it. You can tell them that an animal bit you. Tell them a dog bit you or something. And I'm looking at him and I'm like, get the fuck out of my apartment. So he leaves and I call 911 and I tell him what just happened. And then I hang up, I call my niece, and I ask her to call both of my sons and to meet me at Presbyterian Hospital. So she's like, Aunt Wanda, what happened? I said, just meet me at the emergency room. So I hang up. So I'm scared, I'm crying, I don't want to be by myself. So I go to my next door neighbor's house and I start banging on her door. Michelle, Michelle, open the door. So she don't respond to me, so I start banging on the window, and then I'm banging on her door and I'm screaming her name. Michelle, Michelle, please open the door, please open the door. I need help, Michelle, please open the door. But she never responds to me. So I turn around, I go back into my apartment, blood is still just gushing out of my face. And as I turn around to go into the apartment, the first thing I see on the floor is a piece of my nose, and it still has the earring in it. Jeez. So I go and I pick it up, I run into the kitchen, I rinse it off with cold water, and I get a baggie out of the cabinet and I fill it with ice cubes, and I put that piece of my nose in it. And I go into the bathroom, and I look at myself in the mirror. The part of your nostrils that separates the two was severed. My flesh was hanging to one side, and I could literally see bone and cartilage, and the blood is still just spurting out. So I put the ice onto my face, and I try to push the flesh back over, but it's still hanging. So I'm crying, I'm pacing back and forth, and I'm waiting on the ambulance to come. I'm scared. I don't know what to do. I don't want to be alone. But I am alone. So finally I hear the ambulance coming up. I hear the siren. So I grab my purse and my keys, I lock the door, and I go out to the parking lot to meet them. And as I'm going out, as I round the corner, they had parked and they were coming toward me. And it was a man and a woman. Both of them's face was aghast at the sight of me. The woman literally had a look of disgust in her eyes. So the man asked me what happened, and I began telling him what had just happened, you know, that I had had a fight with my boyfriend and that he had bit me. So by this time, he's opening up the back of the ambulance, and he's putting a stool down for me to climb in. And the woman is still just standing back, staring at me. As I began climbing into the ambulance, I hear her say to him in a low-toned voice, "I'm not going to touch her. Who knows, in this area, she might have AIDS." And her words stung me. And I looked back at her. And then I began climbing into the ambulance. And I get inside, I sit on the bed, right behind where the driver is. She climbs in, she sits on a little bench back by the door. And I'm staring at her, and she's staring at me as he takes off. We're staring at each other. And I'm thinking to myself, you're a first responder. You're supposed to be here to help me. But you're not even trying to help slow the blood flow. You're not trying to clean the wound. You aren't trying to bandage it. You're worried that I have AIDS, as though you don't have gloves or, you know, like you don't have protective, you know, equipment to put on, even if that were the case. So luckily, it was only, you know, a few minutes to the hospital. Presbyterian was right down the street from where I live. It's less than 2 miles. So we get to the hospital. They take me into the emergency room. The nurses take me into one of the rooms and they put me on the bed. They start hooking up IVs to me. And then the police come in and they're asking me questions. They're taking pictures. And so I tell them everything, you know, that I could think of, you know, what his name was, what kind of car he drove. I told him where his mom lived at, where his brothers lived, where some of his friends hung out, just anything I could think of to help them, you know, find him. Because even though I didn't want him to come to the hospital with me because I knew he would be arrested, I didn't want to see that. But I did want him to be punished for what he had done. So the nurses are explaining to me that there's no doctor there, there's no plastic surgeon that's on call at the hospital at the moment. That, you know, they have to call him in and that it would be a few minutes before he got there. And so By this time, the police are through questioning me, they're through taking pictures from every angle. So my son and my niece come through the door. My son just screams my name and he just runs to me. My niece, as she comes through the door, she just collapses. And I'm looking at her as she falls to the floor and the nurses rush over to try to, bring her back around. And I'm thinking to myself, my God, how horrific I must look that she's fainted at the mere sight of me. But she later told me that it wasn't that caused her to pass out. She said that the smell of blood was so heavy in the room that it literally took her breath away. Seemed like hours before the doctor finally arrived. And I'm sure it wasn't that long, but it seemed like it to me. But he explained to me what he was gonna do, but he cautioned me not to expect too much. He said because the nose doesn't have any major arteries or veins that go through it, it's just a small membranous area. So from the moment that tissue was severed, the tissue that was alive began to cut itself off and heal itself. So even though he was going to, put the stitches in it to reattach it and everything, he said, just don't expect it to survive. So pretty soon, I guess I passed out from the anesthesia. And so I woke up the next morning to the sound of the phone ringing. And I see my youngest son go over and pick up the phone, and then he says some cuss words and he runs out of the room. So I'm looking at him wondering who that was. So a few minutes later, he comes back in and I'm asking him who was, and he wouldn't tell me. And so the nurses come in with him and then they move me to another room. Well, I later find out that it was Yori that had called, that in fact he had been calling all night long. And so my son had them move me to another room and gave instructions that they were not to put any phone calls through unless the person asked specifically for my room number, that if anybody asked what room I was in, not to tell them. So I guess I was in the hospital, 5 or 6 days. And during that time, the guys that I worked with at the moving company, they had came by to visit. The girls from my medical assisting class. In fact, the teacher had brought the whole classroom up a couple of nights in a row. And everybody was really very supportive. But for me, it was horrific to be a victim of a domestic violent crime this way, to have my face mutilated. I mean, I felt ashamed. I felt just, it's hard to explain. I began to withdraw into myself. So the day that they released me from the hospital, the police officers had come in that morning and told me that Yori had been arrested in Mesquite. And so I was relieved to know that he had been taken off the streets, that I wouldn't have to worry about him showing up at my door. And so I went home, and it was around the holidays when this happened. And, to tell you the truth, I really don't remember Christmas that year. I don't know if Christmas came and went while I was in the hospital or what, but I just remember being home that New Year's Eve and being angry with God for allowing this to happen to me. Because, I had always been taught that in God's eyes, when things like this happen, they're either necessary or they're allowable. And I just couldn't understand how this could be necessary. What had I done that God would let something like this happen to me, that he deemed it necessary? How could it be allowable? I mean, I was a good person. I mean, I still am a good person. I would help anybody. Tell me a story. I'm a sucker for a story. I'll give a person the shirt off my back. And so I was angry. And I was sitting there in front of my fireplace, and I was drinking a glass of tea, and I was having this long conversation with God. And I mean, I was going in. I was yelling. I was screaming. I was cussing. And honestly, I didn't even give a damn anymore. Because after I got through telling him what I wanted him to know, I was going to take all of the antibiotics and all of the pain pills and fuck the world. I was done with it. So my youngest son and his girlfriend came up. And my youngest son kept saying, Mom, come on now, it's New Year's Eve. Won't you come over to our apartment with us and hang out with us? I'm like, no, go ahead, I'm good. No, Mom, I can't leave you alone by yourself on New Year's Eve. Mama, come on. Boy, I'm good. Go on about your business, I'm good. And his girlfriend just kept staring at me. So eventually they left. A few minutes later, she came back through the door. She said, Wanda, I know what's on your mind. She said, but I'm going to tell you right now, don't do it. If you take your fucking life, your son will not be able to live in this world without his mama. Do not do it. C-Note will be no more good without you in this world. And just hearing those words kind of snapped me back a little bit. And so I didn't. Because, you know, I was so caught up into what I was feeling, what I was going through, that I didn't think of what my death would do to those around me that loved me. But life wasn't easy. I mean, I had got to the point where I go to the mailbox at night because I didn't want anybody to see me. I was embarrassed when I would go to a grocery store. You know, you see a little kid and they peeking around their parent at you and they, you know, hiding. They used to hurt my feelings. Because to me, I thought that child was looking at me like I was some kind of monster. And he was frightened of me. And so I didn't want to go out anymore. I just became a recluse. And like I said, it was months before I went back to work. But I did go back to my classroom. And like I say, everybody was very supportive, you know, because it was mostly women in the class. And I remember sitting in the class one night, and you know how you can smell something before you know what it is? That night, the tears began to run down my face as I sat in that class because I smelled the stench of death. I could smell that tissue in my nose beginning to rot. And I already kind of knew it was dying because it was turning black and I was putting makeup on it, trying to cover it up. And I knew that the tissue had become hard to the touch. But I kept telling myself, the blood is going to start flowing through it. But when I smelled that rotting flesh, I couldn't deny anymore what it was. But I kept wiping the tears because I didn't want my classmates to see me cry, because Lord knows we had cried enough, you know. And one of the girls in the classroom, who later became my daughter-in-law, she passed me a note that night. And she, you know, it had her name and her phone number on it, and she said, if you need to talk, call me. It doesn't matter what time, day or night. And so I guess it was probably 3 or 4 months later that we finally went to court. And I didn't want to testify. I mean, they had the doctor who had testified that, you know, the human bite can be more deadly than a snake bite sometimes because of the bacteria in the mouth and because of the location of the bite being in my face, that had I not sought immediate medical attention, that infection could have set up in my brain and I could have died. The police officers, you know, testified, you know, that I had cooperated. And when they showed that 11 by 14 picture of my face to the jury, and I mean, it was a glossy, like cardboard thing, when they turned it around to the jury and said, this, ladies and gentlemen, is the face of sheer terror. To see the look in my eyes and that torn flesh hanging from my face. And then, you know, there were women from the domestic violence hotline who had testified about, you know, the psyche of women that sometimes they don't want to testify because they're trying to protect their attacker. And it was in that moment that I said to the prosecutor, I will testify, because that wasn't what I was feeling. I did not want to stand before strangers and tell that story, to relive all of that again. But I did. And the prosecutor moved to have Yori's teeth classified as a deadly weapon, and the judge allowed that. And so during the sentencing phase, they asked me what I thought he should be sentenced to, because he was found guilty. And I didn't know. I mean, what do you sentence a person to for a crime such as this, you know? I mean, what I did know was that he was young, and that if you only gave him 1 or 2 years, he could do that easily, and he would not have learned the lesson. So all I could tell them was that it needed to be more than just a few years. And so they wound up sentencing him to 11 years in the state penitentiary. And every year, as he would come up for parole, I would get a letter from the parole board telling me that he had been denied and that he was going to do every day of that time. And throughout, you know, the time that he was in jail, and for the next 2 or 3 years that I lived in that apartment, I would get letters from Yori every week, 2 or 3 letters a week. He would talk about how he still loved me, how he still wanted to be with me, how he would spend the rest of his life trying to make this up to me because he didn't mean to do it. And at some point, I stopped reading the letters, but I kept them, and I numbered them. And I still have the letters to this day, every one of them, 146 letters in a shoebox. Because I feel like at the end of my life, when people are sorting through all of my stuff, I don't want them finding old tax papers and old electric bills. You know how you keep all that old stuff around. I want them to find love letters. I want them to know that somebody loved me in my life, you know? And so I keep them. And so my youngest son wound up dating one of the girls that was in my medical assisting class. And they wound up having a baby. And this little girl, she was so observant. I mean, from day one, she noticed everything. And I remember one day I was holding her in my arms and I was talking to her, just rocking her back and forth, trying to get her to go to sleep. And she pushed away from me. And she was looking at me, and her head tilted from side to side. You know how you could look at a little baby and see their little brain just going round and round? And it was like in that moment, I understood that she knew my face was different. And she reached up with those little bitty hands, and she put her hand across my nose, and then she slid her hand to the side of my cheek, and then she laid her head on my chest. And it was as though she was saying, "It's okay, Nani. It's okay." And you know, a couple of years ago, I was having some problems with my knee. So my contractor told me, he said, "You know, my brother's a doctor in Mexico. Why don't you fly down and see him?" And so I did. And I told my granddaughter, who is now 16, I said, you know, while I'm there, I'm going to see a plastic surgeon and see about getting my nose reconstructed. And she said, "Why?" I mean, she got mad. And she jumped up and ran into the other room. And I didn't understand it. Later on, she told me, she said, "Nani, don't." She said, "There is nothing wrong with your face." She says, "The only way I know you, Nani." She said, "You a boss." She said, "It's okay, Nani. It's okay." I'm Wanda Allen Ward, and this is my truth.
Everybody, that's Miss Wanda Allen.
Thank you for sharing your truth.
All right. Coming to the stage.